When the Tet Offensive was over, the National Liberation Front was nearly wiped out, leaving the Americans in control of the cities and most of the hamlets of South Vietnam. For their effort, the Communists had lost a total of 45,000 dead, while the Americans and South Vietnamese lost 6,000. Since the planners of the offensive expected a people's uprising, the most secret of the communist cells had been ordered to emerge and lead the fight in the open. When the offensive was defeated, cell members had to flee to the jungle. Thus, the Tet Offensive ended in the destruction of much of the NLF infrastructure in the south. This was a heavy blow to the communist war effort. After Tet, the regular North Vietnamese army did most of the fighting against the U.S. However, the Tet Offensive also brought about a different kind of turning point. It strongly influenced the opinion of the American public. For the first time in a major war, the power of television became apparent. 50 million people watched the destruction brought on by the war. The U.S. government was no longer able to portray the war in Southeast Asia as clean, simple, and easily won. President Lyndon Johnson and the U.S. generals had claimed the enemy was in decline long before Tet. But the moment Vietnamese commandos penetrated the American embassy in Saigon, all the official propaganda crumbled to dust. The war now seemed never-ending to middle-class America. The New Year offensive effectively ended Johnson's presidency. The senselessness of it was reflected in the notorious comment of a U.S. officer who explained the destruction of about one-third of the provincial capital of Ben Tre. It became necessary to destroy it in order to save it. Separate from conventional, unconventional operations of the 5th Special Forces Group were the clandestine operations of Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, MACV-SOG. The Studies and Observation Group was a cover name to disguise SOG's real function, and the name Special Operations Group, as it was sometimes called, described its real mission more accurately. The all-volunteer MACV-SOG activated in January of 1964. SOG was a joint services unit composed of members from all 4 branches of the armed forces, including Navy SEALs, Marine Recons, Air Force Special Operations pilots of the 90th Special Operations Wing, but predominantly Army Special Forces. They carried out some of the most dangerous and challenging special operations of the Vietnam War. MACV-SOG made high-altitude, low-opening parachute jumps behind enemy lines, routinely carried out reconnaissance missions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, penetrated deep into Laos and Cambodia, recovered downed pilots, and attempted several POW rescues. Ranging deep in the enemy's rear, MACV-SOG reconnaissance teams forced Hanoi to divert 40,000 troops, about 4 divisions, to rear security missions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. While some infantrymen in Vietnam despaired of ever seeing the enemy, MACV-SOG teams often found themselves fighting their way out of a hornet's nest of angry NVA battalions. With small reconnaissance teams numbering less than 10 men, MACV-SOG tied down thousands of NVA troops, provided invaluable intelligence information to the Pentagon, and destroyed large amounts of enemy material while inflicting grievous losses on the NVA.
We were basically going into their territory and saying, we can play this game too.
SOG was the brainchild of future CIA Director William Colby. As Hanoi stepped up infiltration of the South by the NVA, the U.S. countered with a series of covert attacks on the North. The unit organized to send a message to the communist leaders was the Studies and Operation Group, SOG. It was commanded by an Army colonel, but it did not answer to the Vietnam Command in Saigon. Its only masters were the Joint Chiefs in Washington. It was so secret that only 5 officers in Saigon were ever briefed on SOG.
Well, they had a pretty good system that they worked out with. They even had their own air assets that were attached to SOG, that were helicopter assets that would come in and take them out. And they did a good job. Many cases of extraction under fire.
Originally organized to train and lead friendly guerrilla forces behind enemy lines, Special Forces now had to train and reorganize for direct action missions as pure SF teams, or as leaders of indigenous volunteers and mercenaries into enemy-controlled areas beyond the borders of South Vietnam. Since the governments of Laos and Cambodia desperately attempted to remain neutral and prevent being destroyed by the same agony killing millions in Vietnam, they were too close to the flame to avoid getting burned. As a result, MACV SOG teams operated in secret against communist forces and shadow governments, thus enabling the U.S. administration's claim to be only advising local forces. They were supposedly only studying and observing while advising local forces in defense of their regions. It was a thinly veiled legal fiction that mirrored the changing of grid coordinates in document records to avoid admitting the reality of close air support and bombing missions across the borders.
In fact, SOG, when it starts out in 65 when it goes into Laos, in particular, it catches the enemy off guard, of course. The enemy's used to the Americans not coming into Laos, and suddenly these little teams show up, usually generally staying very quiet, and the rules of engagement again being not to be seen, not to fire on. And a fair amount of intelligence is brought back, but frankly, how much intelligence can a small team bring back in the greater scope of the Ho Chi Minh Trail? Not very much.
The members of SOG were the best of the best, but even these shadow warriors could not prevail against an enemy that was on high alert. Since they often operated deep inside enemy lines, stealth and light loads were necessary to fulfill their missions and to escape if compromised. While the CAR-15 submachine gun version of the M16 was a popular individual weapon, point men or whole teams often carried AK-47s to confuse enemy troops when they returned fire, and also allowed the use of captured ammunition if necessary. Individual uniforms and gear carried often was the choice of the team leader or the soldiers themselves.
We had C rations, which were canned rations that the military had. We had probably 3 days worth or 4 days we were carrying with you. I was the radio man, so I was carrying the PRC-25 radio, which was a FM radio, relatively short range, but we could easily reach the Covey fact that was flying around. And I'd carry a battery and ammunition, water, and a weapon.
Whatever they found that worked for them was what they were usually allowed to use in combat, in a clandestine war far from parade fields and sergeants major. Spit and polish had no place in the war in the shadows, deep inside enemy territory.
Black pajamas was what the Viet Cong normally wore. So if we were in an area which was the enemy's territory and they saw someone in black pajamas, they wouldn't think it was Americans. And therefore, if we saw them at the same time, we would have the advantage of knowing that anyone we saw we were going to kill. And so it gave us a slight advantage. That was the main purpose of the black pajamas.
Locating an LZ to place a team was not as easy as it sounds.
The problem is there's only so many clearings in jungles of Laos. It got to the point where the North Vietnamese militia that guarded the trail, called Binh Troms, which were units, regimental-sized units, that were their whole job was to run the anti-aircraft, run the reaction forces, and keep their section of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. All along the trail is a different bin trom. They have this segment. That's all they did. One of their jobs got to be watching the clearings, going after the SOG guys.
The stated mission of the SOG was to execute an intensified program of harassment, diversion, political pressure, capture of prisoners, physical destruction, acquisition of intelligence, generation of propaganda, and diversion of resources against the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Simply put, they patrolled, raided, and rescued downed crewmen. They led teams of QRF, or Quick Reaction Forces, comprised of small American teams or larger local forces under their leadership, to rescue Allied units in trouble in Laos and Cambodia. They were the Special Operations Fire Brigade, who could go where the regular military could not.
Well, in the early days, the point was to do your recon without making contact. If you made contact, you had bungled your mission. But towards the end, the idea was to take prisoners.
They were recruited, trained, equipped, and sent into the shadows to cover a lot of ground and create the maximum damage on short notice. Their operations are among the least known of the Vietnam War. That also means that a large portion of their losses are considered missing in action to this very day. Few that were captured or killed on operations were ever rescued or recovered. It was known by the operators that the missions were the most dangerous sort and that many would not return. The teams were usually a mixture of local native volunteers or refugee ethnic groups who often fought against their millennial foes and felt intense loyalty to their American teammates.
We were using 12-man teams. 3 Americans, which was the team leader, which was the 1-0. We had a assistant team leader, which was the 1-1, and the radio operator, which was a 1-2. They were the Americans. The rest of them were indigenous personnel. They could be Nongs, who are basically Chinese Vietnamese, or Montagnards, who were the mountain people. And the Montagnards were really the good ones to be with because they lived in the woods, they knew how to move through the woods, versus the Nongs, who were basically city folk.
One thing that SOG veterans say, I'm probably going on a limb here, but a lot of things that they say is that they had a huge impact on the North Vietnamese in Laos and Cambodia, in that they tied up regiments, whole regiments of North Vietnamese who had to remain behind to watch for these special forces. Not true. They didn't tie anybody up. That was a job of the Binh Troms that were already there. It didn't matter whether special forces was there or not. They were going to be there doing their job. Main force units that were coming into South Vietnam never were tied up against SOG. If you were a Binh Trom in Laos, would you rather have a SOG team come to get you or the 101st Airborne? Yeah, I'd take a SOG team. Dangerous as they are, still pretty small. So in the greater scope of things, they did not they were good intelligence gatherers, did not tie troops up inside Laos.
We gave the military some intelligence that they never really would have had or known if we hadn't have been doing our mission, particularly in the early part, because there was a lot of doubt whether the North Vietnamese Army was involved or wasn't involved in the early part of the when I was there, and that issue was quickly solved when we had pictures of them marching down the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
By the mid-60s, SOG's days were numbered.
By 66, 67, like I say, the Vietnamese had gotten pretty good at knowing where they were. So most of the heroic stories you hear of SOG are heroic in the sense that they got found, they're running, and they're trying to get extracted. That's where most of the heroics occur. Well, what's the original mission of these guys? It's to stay quiet and undetected. So by the late period, by 67, certainly 68 and 69, the average time on the ground was very, very short. By late period, SOG was fighting a lot, and they were fighting because they'd been spotted and seen, and there's just no way around it. Like I say, you can't come in. There's only so many places you can land in a jungle. They could have walked over the border, but that would have taken weeks or months sometimes because it's just too far. Not very good for the mission.
By 1971, SOG was disbanded officially, but during their secretive years, SOG had logged a combat record unequal in U.S. history. SOG's improvisations helped forge today's special ops doctrine for units such as Delta Force. It is no coincidence that U.S. Special Ops teams that probed deep behind the lines in Iraq were on blue light duty, the concept of which was developed by SOG.
A lot of lessons learned from Vietnam have been preached and taught in the curriculum at Fort Bragg. So in reality, I think a lot has been passed on, because a lot of the guys that were in SOG ended up staying in, were sergeant majors and officers, and they have basically interwoven our experiences and lessons learned into the curriculum down at Fort Bragg. So I feel very good, and I think that the kids are much better prepared now, much smarter. Their equipment is far superior to what we had.